Hey folks, welcome to week 5 of DMD 105, Digital Design Foundations. How is everybody doing? Hope you're doing well, practicing with Photoshop, having some fun. All right, so this week in week 5, let's go down to module 5 here. We are going to dive into something fun with Photoshop, and we are going to take a look at the proper use of filters. So far in Photoshop, we've done very practical things like learning how to use the eraser tool, learning how to use all the selection tools, using the channels tool, creating alpha channels, learning how to cut things out, and of course learning how to composite images together from a variety of images into a new composition, which is all great stuff, super important, and you've all been doing a great job. This week we're going to dive into the use of filters. Now, Photoshop filters are sort of very popular in that people love to turn photographs into something that looks like a watercolor painting or an oil painting, or looks like it's all bright and starry or on fire or whatever. There's all sorts of fun and useful filters in Photoshop, and they are certainly useful, and they're very practical and can make your images or your composites or whatever you're working on in Photoshop look really amazing. Even if you're doing digital painting in Photoshop, it's nice to be able to use the filter system to sort of add some artistic flourish to what you're doing. Now, as great as that is, use of filters, of course, can be overdone, and we see this all the time out in the world as people using too many filters in Photoshop and something just looks overdone, right? So we're going to take a look at how the filter functionality works in Photoshop and sort of talk about ways in which you can use it that are effective without really overdoing it. Now, before we get to that, let's take a look at your consumables this week. Under the Read, View, and Listen section, you have 2 great videos to watch on top of this one here. This is from Photoshop Playbook, which is how to use filters in Photoshop. They're going to go over sort of their way of using filters, which might overlap with what I'm showing you a little bit, but it's always good to get another perspective. And then down here, the second video talks about the use of smart filters. We've talked a little bit so far in class about certain things in Photoshop that are both destructive and non-destructive. And so filters is kind of the same thing in that there's a destructive way to use filters, and then there's a non-destructive way to use filters. And the non-destructive way is using smart filters. So I'm going to show you that too. We're going to go over it more in class later, but this video covers smart filters specifically. So make sure you watch both videos and certainly practice along in Photoshop with this on your own. We're going to obviously be using the filter gallery today, which is the most important thing as far as what we're doing. And just to give you a little heads up, your homework, of course, this week is to continue working on Project 1, your retro movie poster. By now, you have submitted a draft of it. You've gotten some feedback on that. So keep working on that because it'll be due soon. So make sure that you get that finished up and do a really good job with it. All right, now let's hop over into Photoshop and take a look at filters. So in the week 5 folder, under files, there's some sample photos you can use to test out the filters. And of course, you can use your own photos too. Feel free to stick your own photos into Photoshop and play around with those for the filters or for whatever you're working on. It's a good idea. Okay, so this photo here, this is a flautist in a parade. It's a really nice photo with some black shadowing and whatnot. And so oftentimes people want to add filters to images to make them look as if they're not exactly photographs, to make them look a little more artistic or give them some kind of flourish. So the first thing you got to do, just like anything in Photoshop, is when you open up an image, you're going to go over to the Layers palette and double click on the thumbnail, and then you can name your layer something, right? So we'll just name this flautist, only because it's a fun word. Hit OK, and then that unlocks the layer and of course gives it a name. Now you're ready to start applying some filters to it. Now the filter gallery in Photoshop, before we open it up and I show you where it is, I just want to let you know that it works under a functionality that's called a plug-in. So there are a variety of third-party tools available for Photoshop that you can actually download from the Photoshop website. These are pieces of software that are sort of like add-ons or plug-ins to Photoshop that add some additional functionality to the software that maybe the folks at Adobe didn't create, other people created, and Adobe has adopted them or allowed them to be used in Photoshop. And instead of working inside of Photoshop like we see here, you know, all of the palettes and tools in Photoshop are obviously inside the software itself. They work in sort of a floating window on top of Photoshop, and that's sort of a plug-in functionality. Now the filters gallery works as a plug-in because years and years ago, most of the initial filters for Photoshop were created by third-party programmers and therefore worked as plugins. Eventually, Adobe purchased those from their original creators and added them in as built-in plugins to Photoshop, and they continue to add to them. So what happens is you go up here to the File menu, right, at the top of your screen, go to your File menu, and Filter gets its own pull-down menu. And there are some freestanding filters, right? So in a little later in the week, we're going to talk about converting to smart filters, so we'll get to that later. But the filter gallery is accessible here, which we'll get to in a second. And then there's some sort of secondary filters that just sort of exist outside of the filter gallery. Some of them are photographic, like adaptive wide angle, camera raw filter, lens correction, and vanishing point. We'll skip over Liquify for now. We'll get back to that one in a little bit. Those are basically digital filters that help replicate the way certain lenses on professional cameras work. We're not going to get into those in this class, but from a photography point of view, they're super useful. And then there's some other filters that are down here in these little sort of folding menus. We're going to play around with some of those later, but we really want to focus on the filter gallery right now. So you click on that, and it opens up the filter gallery, and as you can see, it's a floating window. I'm going to shrink this down a little bit so you can see it a little more clearly. You can see that this filter gallery is a floating window that now pops up in front of the original Photoshop window, so it works as a floating plugin. All right, now the filter gallery is broken down into 3 columns. The first section here on the left is a visual preview of your image, right? The next column is a collection of folders full of different types of filters. There are artistic filters, filters based on brush strokes, distortion filters, sketch filters, this is one of them, stylized filters, and texture filters. Now, the artistic folder is probably the more popular one. A lot of people like these. Now, each of the filters inside each folder is shown using a thumbnail, right? Now, the thumbnail is not reflective of your actual image. They use this little sailboat image for every single one of them. It would be more useful if it was a small version of your actual photo, but instead they sort of go for this perpetual sailboat, which is everywhere. So if you want your photograph to take on the attributes of, say, a colored pencil drawing, you click on that filter, give it a second, and it will convert it to a colored pencil drawing. Now, depending on how powerful your computer is, will depend on how long it takes for that filter to apply itself. Some filters eat up more memory than others, and therefore it might be a little slow, so just give it a minute, right? You'll sort of see the blue progress bar at the bottom here. So anyway, now it's converted my photo to look as if it was drawn with a bunch of colored pencils, right? Which is great. Now, it doesn't just apply the filter and then you're all done. You can make some adjustments to how that filter functions by going over to the third column over here, and that gives you some sliders that allow you to adjust some different attributes of the filter. So you can change the width of the pencil by doing this, and then it will recalibrate itself. See, it's changing as we're talking about it. You can address the pressure on the stroke of the pencil, meaning how lightly or firmly you would be pressing down on the colored pencils if you were doing this in real life, right? So that's sort of the idea, right? And then, of course, how bright the paper is, you know, the virtual paper that this is on. So if you want it to look like it's on a piece of white paper or light paper, you can simply increase the brightness this way. So that's sort of how that works. And you can keep adjusting them until you're really happy with it, right? Now, if all you wanted to do was make it look like a colored pencil drawing, you could say, okay, I'm all done now, and then just go ahead and hit the OK button. And when you do that, watch what happens. I'll hit OK, and it applies that function, that filter, right to your original photograph back in Photoshop, and the overlay of the filter gallery goes away, right? Now, using the filter gallery the way I'm doing it right now is a destructive option. What I mean by that is the changes that I just made in the filter gallery now permanently affect the pixels of the photograph. And you can tell that because over here in the Layers palette, you'll see that my layer has permanently changed, right? I have no way to get back to my original photograph. So it's a destructive way to do it. Later on in the week, I'll show you the non-destructive way to do this. But it's easier to teach you the filters gallery the destructive way first, and then once you play around with that, then we'll get into the non-destructive way. So for now, to go back to my original photograph, I'm just going to use the history palette right here and just go backwards in time. Okay, now I'm going to go back into the filter gallery. Go back to filter. Remember, don't click the first version of filter gallery because all that does is replicate what you just did and will reapply those colored pencil filters that I just did. So go down to the second occurrence of filter gallery And then that'll put us back into the floating gallery option. Now you'll notice that the filter gallery remembers the last filter you used, so it just reapplies it, which is great. But you can bop around and see some other ones. There's cutout, right, which makes it look like pieces of paper that are cut out, right? And again, there are adjustments you can make over here. You know, whichever the adjustments are will differ depending on the filter. Something that looks like a dry brush, right? We can increase the brush size so it's more dramatic, right? We can make it look like film grain, which gives it kind of that. Neon glow, I'm going to sort of bop around, right? And you can change the glow color by simply clicking this here and adjusting what you want that to be. That opens up our color picker. See, you can see the glow changes. You can make it look like posterized edges, kind of like a comic book, which is that. Sponge painting, and so on and so on. The only way to really get to know the different filters is to play around with them, so sort of click through them. And then, of course, like I said, there's different folders. You can look at sort of brush strokes, so it looks like angular strokes, or cross-hatching, for example, kind of like this. You can make it look like sprayed strokes. Now, most of these filters maintain the color palette from the original photograph and then just apply the filter. But some other ones, like if you go down to the sketch folder, you can see here that it actually changes the color of it, and it's based on what your foreground color was when you left Photoshop. So for example, if I go back over to Photoshop here, you'll see that my foreground color was red. So if I were to, and so therefore it applies red to this series of filters under Sketch. So if I want it to look like a photocopy, I can click that, but it uses red as the primary color. If I want to change that, I can cancel out of the filter gallery, go back into Photoshop, go back to my color picker, and pick a color that I really want to use, like maybe this light blue color. Then go back into the filter gallery, and you'll see that it will now use that color as the primary color when I go back over to Sketch, and I'll pick like charcoal drawing if I want it to look like a charcoal drawing. See, now blue is the primary color. So if you know you're going to use these types of filters that present themselves in the thumbnails as black and white, you adjust your color over here in the color picker back in Photoshop before you hop into the filter gallery, right? And so again, I can adjust the thickness of the charcoal and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's the basics of the filter gallery. Now, one thing in the third column that's important is you'll see that the filter gallery has sort of its own version of a layers palette. And right now there's just one layer, and it just shows you the current filter that you've applied. So I've applied a charcoal filter. If you want to see what the original photograph looks like without the filter, you can just shut the eyeball off, and it temporarily shuts it off so that I can sort of remember what the original photo looks like. However, one of the other cool things you can do here in the filter gallery is you can add a different filter layer by going down here to the plus symbol at the bottom of the filter layer, adds a new effect, and in a strange sort of turn, what it does is it duplicates your existing layer, but that's not really what's great about it. You can go here back to the filter gallery, make sure that you've chosen one of the layers, and you can pick a different filter. So I'm going to go back up to artistic, and I'm going to pick sort of cutout. And what it will do, it will apply that filter on top of the existing filter. And these filters are translucent, meaning you can partially see through them. And so therefore it merges the effects of one filter with the effects of the other filter below it. You can keep making layers and sort of mix and match the filters to get the effects you want. Whichever one you've selected will give you the adjustments up here, so I can keep changing those adjustments as I go, and sort of really fine-tune this, okay? So you can sort of customize the filters. So let's say I'm really happy with that, and that's what I want, and I've spent some time with it. Then I can just simply go ahead and hit OK, and it will apply the two filters now to this. Okay, so all I want you guys to do now is just really sort of play around with the filters. Use a photo, use either one of the photos I gave you, or upload the photos that you want, and then play around with different filters, get different effects, see what combinations you can come up with, play with the variables, and really just sort of get to know the filter gallery, okay? Next time in class, we are going to go over the Liquify gallery, which is a lot of fun, and we're going to go back to the filter gallery, but we're going to look at it from a non-destructive point of view, okay? All right, so go have some fun with that. Keep working on Project One, and I will talk to you